Lev Zasetsky said that he was killed on March 2, 1943, a line which he wrote in the past tense because he was probably right, which is confusing. He wrote it again and again during 25 years of observation by one of the Soviet Union's most accomplished neuropsychologists, eventually compiling a 3,000-page diary recollecting his life story. He could write by hand, but he himself was unable to read it, which is strange. It became one of the most valuable, insightful texts on the study of the human brain in the history of biological science. But Lev Zasetsky, whose horrific shrapnel wound to the brain in World War II that ended up destroying his life, was not a researcher or scholar. He was the one being studied. And his story won't just make you rethink what reading and writing are or how your own brain works, but it'll make you question whether a spoon can really be separated from the soup it sits in. Lev Zasetsky was just 20 years old when Germany enacted Operation Barbarossa, a surprise invasion of the Soviet Union. As a child, Lev had been fascinated by science, which he only vaguely remembered. He graduated with honors from middle school and went on to complete 3 years at a polytechnic institute in Tula, where he did advanced work in chemistry. Early one morning, I was heading for the institute thinking about my future when suddenly I heard there was a war on with Germany. They had already invaded and we had to defend our country. The Komsomol mobilization had sent to the front fourth-year students who, for the time being, had to forego their work at the institute until the war was over. At 20, Lev the scientist was already gone and Lev the soldier was born. That mobilization took him directly to the front lines, where he eventually gained command of Flamethrower Platoon 33A and served with distinction. A document of the Central Archive of the Ministry of Defense shows that he was a military technician of the first rank, a participant in the Patriotic War from January 1942 in the position of platoon commander of a separate flamethrower company attached to the 222nd Rifle Division of the 33rd Army. With his platoon, he destroyed 5 German pillboxes, personally killing 5 Germans. By March of 1943, the German 6th Army had surrendered at Stalingrad. But the Wehrmacht was in the middle of defeating the Soviets at the Third Battle of Kharkov. Nearly 1,500 kilometers south, Lev Zasetsky was leading his unit across a river in Smolensk when he was hit in the head by shell fragments that penetrated the left parieto-occipital area of the cranium and left him in a prolonged coma. He had an opening in his skull of 16 square centimeters, and he'd lost a quarter of his brain matter. The Red Army wasn't able to perform a cranioplasty with tantalum plates as some Western allies could. He was just kept alive in a field hospital as his body attempted to heal and scar tissue made permanent alterations to his brain. Lev Zasetsky had been taken out of a war against man and thrust into a fight to the death against nature. Nearly 70 years before neuropsychologist Alexander Luria first met Lev Zasetsky, science had only a rudimentary understanding of aphasia, the loss of the ability to process and formulate language. Why did some people seem to understand the world around them but had lost the ability to talk about it? Why did some people develop aphasia from unexpected, unseen internal injuries like strokes and others from physical trauma? Why didn't everyone who experienced physical trauma develop aphasia? And how did Phineas Gage survive an iron rod being driven directly through his skull and brain and out the other side and not lose any of his communicative faculties? In 1873, an article in Popular Science called On Acquired Physical Habits described the state of pathological research as showing that aphasia comes from malnutrition of a certain part of the cerebrum, and the tracing of this malnutrition back to an interruption in the supply of blood. That same year, a paragraph in the miscellany section of Popular Science claimed that aphasia is produced by an incapacity to execute the coordinate movements requisite for pronunciation and that it has nothing to do with loss of memory as to the meaning of words. Oh, brother. Come on, it was like 150 years ago. Think how difficult it was to understand what was happening. You need to have a clearly defined map of all parts of the brain. You need to understand what those parts do and don't do and how they work in tandem. You need to know what affects their operation in the short term and long term, what damage does to each part, what can be healed and what can't. And all of that needs to be placed in the context of both the state of medicine and the actual lives of the patients, all without any imaging or non-invasive examinations of any kind. Studying the long-term effects of traumatic brain injuries was particularly difficult in the 1800s because so many of those who suffered those injuries just died. But we were making progress on understanding the inner workings of the brain and fast. In the August 1875 issue of Popular Science, Infirmities of Speech described a rare form of aphasia in which the intellect is unaltered, memory is good, the patient writes easily, and expresses his thoughts correctly in writing as educated deaf-mutes do. The recovery of the art of writing, where it is recovered, is gradual. In an 1885 edition of Popular Science, W.R. Benedict described aphasia as simply a disturbance of the power of speech. He broke it down into two categories: amnesic aphasia, in which a patient forgets substantives and names, misuses words, or forgets the language they knew altogether, and ataxic aphasia, in which the power of articulation is completely lost, despite the patient fully understanding a word, although not being able to use it despite vigorous effort. Through the 1880s and 1890s, articles about or mentioning aphasia were common in Popular Science, like Centers of Ideation in the Brain and Word Blindness. And then the progress just stopped. You know, we do a lot of retro tech on this channel, but what about the future of online privacy protection? Well, this video is sponsored by DuckDuckGo Privacy Pro, the 3-in-1 subscription service that helps protect your personal info from being exploited by hackers, scammers, and privacy-invasive companies. And it's from DuckDuckGo, who we trust because all their products are designed to stop your personal information from being collected. We found the DuckDuckGo VPN super easy to set up in just a few clicks. It secures your Wi-Fi connection anywhere on up to 5 devices at once, and hides your device location and IP address from the sites you visit, so you can browse, game shop, or do whatever you do online with an extra layer of protection. Personal information removal is great if you've ever searched for yourself online and found your name, email, or home address everywhere. On desktop devices, Privacy Pro helps to find and remove that info from data brokers and people search sites that store and sell it. And their identity theft restoration service can help restore your identity if it gets stolen, with 24/7 assistance and help replacing lost wallet items like your driver's license or bank cards. Try Privacy Pro free for 7 days, then pay $9.99 per month. Click the link in the description or scan the QR code on screen. Thanks. The final appearance of the word aphasia in all of Popular Science came in May of 1913 in an article about William Harvey, the 17th century physician who unraveled the circulation of blood. The next great leap in understanding the physical mechanisms of the brain and its related traumas came with the imaging revolution of the 1970s. The CT scanner finally allowed us to look inside. But in that interim period, something happened that generated more observable cases of brain injury than in the whole of human history before it: 2 world wars. The Great War in World War II affected every populated continent on the globe, and in a sort of twisted silver lining for medical progress, the tens of millions of casualties provided doctors with opportunities to develop more effective treatment for acute brain injuries and to improve rehabilitation after. Alexander Luria was assigned to care for over 800 patients hospitalized by traumatic brain injury. One was Lev Zasetsky. Luria first met Zasetsky toward the end of May 1943, almost 3 months after he had been wounded, and found that he simply could not write and realized he had suddenly become illiterate. It was a case so nuanced, so tragic, and so powerful that Luria spent decades trying to understand it, culminating in The Man with a Shattered World, The History of a Brain Wound, which Oliver Sacks said turned science into poetry. Lev Zasetsky had lost virtually all ability to use words, with all words seeming vaguely familiar with meanings that were incomplete and unformed. For Lev, choosing the right word wasn't just like finding a needle in a haystack, it was finding a needle in a stack of needles. The result was essentially paralysis. When he ran an errand to a government office back home in Tula, he was so afraid he wouldn't remember the few words he needed to carry on a conversation that he simply waited in the hallway outside, working up the nerve to give even a simple conversation a shot. It was just as bad as he thought it would be. The few words I needed to use seemed deliberately to have slipped my mind, all of them. Something felt very wrong in my head. I just couldn't remember a thing. He could see, though, sort of. His vision was equal parts disorienting and fascinating. His entire right side of his field of vision was completely gone, which forced him to turn his head to view anything that wasn't on his left. What he could see was a maelstrom. Through and beyond the objects I see are endless numbers of tiny shifting swarms of midges that make it hard for me to look at objects themselves. This swarm affected his ability to understand what he was seeing so much that he wasn't able to distinguish the first letter of any word. But closing his eyes was even worse. There were 2 days and nights I didn't dare close my eyes. I seemed to be having hallucinations of some ugly thing, something weird. A human face but with enormous ears, and eyes that were just as peculiar. And if it wasn't a Picassoan rendering of some unknown person, he'd see other faces, objects, and rooms of different sorts, leading him to open his eyes as fast as he could. He would also lose parts of his own body because he would forget that he couldn't see his own right side. Often I fall into a kind of stupor and I don't understand what's going on around me. I have no sense of objects. One minute I stand there thinking about something, the next I lapse into forgetfulness. But suddenly I'll come to, look to the right of me, and be horrified to discover half of my body is gone. Zasetsky called these kinds of incidents spatial peculiarities. He couldn't remember how to navigate the town he grew up in, and Luria described his relationship with space as being broken into thousands of separate parts. He said that the problem was not that he failed to see an object, he would recognize it, know what it was for, and how to use it, but it was altogether different when he tried to orient himself in space, distinguish right from left, or gauge the distance and relationship between two objects. Lev didn't really understand anything anymore. He'd wake up with pressure in his stomach, but not realize it meant he had to go to the bathroom. He was afraid to reach out and touch objects on a table, and he was unable to see a single object as a whole, causing him to get frightened when a spoon would get lost in his soup. A simple comprehension test illustrates exactly what it was like to live with Lev's brain. He was asked to listen to the following paragraph. On both sides of the house were large trees of a rare variety that had big berries resembling fir cones on the underside of the leaves. In the pond, across which 4 white swans were gliding, one could see the reflections of the Chinese lanterns, made out of brightly colored paper that were hung everywhere and depicted grotesque, grinning faces. Then he was asked to decipher it. This was his answer. No, I can't make anything out of it. They're talking about, it's hard to say, about lantern lights and about swans in a pond and something like woods on both sides, swans and lantern lights. there are these trees on both sides and berries and some more lantern lights and swans floating. There's a house and alongside it fruit trees. They look like fir trees. Then there are also lanterns and a pond, swans floating near them, horns. And so lantern lights, colored paper. No, I just don't understand it. How do you live in a world that makes no sense at all? How do you exist when every second of your life is an unsolvable puzzle and the tiny bits you do manage to recognize can't come out? The real question is, why would you go on? Luria pinpointed Lev's injury to the second major block of the brain located in the posterior sections of the large hemispheres. This portion of the brain's entire job is to act as a block for receiving, processing, and retaining information a person derives from the external world. Luria posited that within that area is another tertiary sector whose function is to combine the visual, occipital, tactile motor, parietal, and auditory vestibular temporal sections of the brain, which are the most complex formations in this second block and the last part of the brain to develop in human evolution. That's in line with the 1875 Popular Science Infirmities of Speech article, which highlights discoveries made by neuroscience pioneer Paul Broca that pins aphasia to the left anterior part of the brain and more specifically to the third cerebral convolution, the same region that Luria refers to as the tertiary sector. Even as far back as 1873, after performing a series of electroshock tests on various animal brains, a Professor Ferrier was able to link aphasia to the left side of the brain in the posterior part of the inferior frontal convolution, also associating it with paralysis of the right hand. The precise location of Lev's shrapnel injury meant that a very important function had been seriously impaired. He could not immediately combine his impressions into a coherent whole. His world became fragmented. But his frontal cortex was entirely undamaged. Luria wrote that the frontal cortex allows for a person's capacity to recognize his defects and wish to overcome them, and that Lev Zasetsky was acutely aware of what it means to be human and, to the extent his strength permitted, worked feverishly to overcome his problems. Lev's human spirit was intact. He just needed a way to channel it. He lost the ability to read or write anything immediately following his injury, but he still tried. He'd forgotten how to use a pencil. He couldn't control it or even hold it. And when he tried to read, he found that he had to go one letter at a time, reciting the alphabet until he got to the letter he saw, which he actually could do. He couldn't remember a word he just heard, and he couldn't remember anything about his time on the front lines or how to get home from across the street. But he could remember parts of his childhood and things he learned then. He knew the alphabet. Luria called these sorts of memories kinetic melodies, or a series of built-in movements that once mastered at a young age become second nature in adulthood. That meant Lev still possessed the ability to write somewhere in his brain. He just needed to figure out how to access it. The letter-by-letter approach had gotten Lev absolutely nowhere. But then a doctor told him to stop trying. He asked Lev to write a whole word without thinking about it or lifting his hand from the paper. He repeated the word crove or blood out loud a few times, and then he actually wrote it. Lev couldn't read, he couldn't understand what he saw, and he couldn't navigate the world around him, but he suddenly could write. His previously meaningless days now had meaning. He could do something again. In just 6 months, he learned to write as well as he could before his injury. He still wasn't exactly literate. Words still meant nothing to him, not in the automatic and nuanced way they do for us. He had to break each word down into its letters and syllables to begin to decipher it. When I look at a word like головокружение, dizziness, I just can't understand it. But soon something begins to stir in my mind. I look at the first letter, G, and wait until I remember how to pronounce it. Then I go on to the letter O and pronounce the whole syllable. But the further he got into a word, the letters he'd figured out were gone. While I'm looking at that letter, the two letters to the left of it escape my vision. At that point, I see only a gray mist in which spots, threads, and little bodies seem to shift and flicker back and forth. But still, it was progress. He could only write about 10 lines a day, sometimes a page, which would take him all day, and the personal cost was tremendous. If I do spend a whole day at it, the next day or 2 or 3, my head aches so badly I often have to stay in bed. And each time he recovered, he went right back to writing his autobiography. Luria wrote that Lev's goal was to write a journal describing the terrible abyss into which his injury had hurled him and the struggle it took for him to recover what he had lost. By the time Alexander Luria had completed what became a 25-year observation period of one of the most unique patients, Lev Zasetsky had written a 3,000-page document which he could not read. One of the most remarkable aspects of Lev's book is that he completed his story multiple times. When he finished one iteration, he would start from the beginning again to express himself more clearly as his writing improved and to tell more of his own story as he remembered it over time. As he wrote, Lev found that he very slowly rehabilitated his ability to communicate. By doing it again and again, I don't know how many times I've rewritten this over the years, my speaking ability has improved. I really do speak better now and can remember words that were scattered into bits and pieces by my head wound. By training myself through thinking and writing, I've gotten to the point where I can carry on a conversation, at least about simple everyday matters. The Disney version of this story ends right here. Lev Zasetsky, the author, overcame tragedy and lived happily ever after. It's great. But Lev Zasetsky never really lived happily at all. The problem wasn't just that he couldn't do most of the things that make up daily life, it's that he knew he couldn't do them. His writing included a stark degree of self-awareness. He understood that he was not fit for anything else. So it turns out that because my memory is so bad, I'll never understand anything about geometry, grammar, physics, or any other science. What's happened to my life is simply terrible. This strange illness I have is like living without a brain. What I remember one minute is gone the next, so that I can't understand theorems or even simple things in my surroundings. What Luria called Lev's shattered existence invokes imagery of a whole so hopelessly broken into so many pieces that it was impossible to even start putting them back together in a meaningful way. To Lev, it was just living life without a brain. Lev said that the point of my writing is to show how I have been and still am struggling to recover my memory. It's an extremely difficult fight. By working on that one story of mine every day, I hoped I'd be able to tell people about this illness and overcome it. Lev Zasetsky died on September 9, 1993, at the age of 73. When he started writing, he titled his book, The Story of a Terrible Brain Injury. By the time he was done, he'd changed that title to I'll Fight On. See you in the future.